It all started on a day that seemed ordinary at first, like any other day in my life. Just going about my business, living in my routine. But it only took a moment for everything to come crashing down, as the truth I had been oblivious to was finally revealed. It was one of those rare, eye-opening moments when you realize that everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you was nothing but an illusion. I guess we all have that one moment in life when the facade falls apart. For me, it came when I discovered that my wife, Ellen, and my brother, Neil, were having an affair behind my back. It wasn't just the act of infidelity that shattered me. It was the realization that the people I trusted the most had been hiding such a monumental betrayal from me for so long. I had always thought of Ellen and Neil as the two most important people in my life. Ellen, my wife, the woman I had built my life with, and Neil, my brother, who had been my confidant and closest ally. They were my support system, the people I turned to when life got tough. We had shared countless memories, laughter, and even tears together. Our bond, I thought, was unbreakable, but the more I reflected on it, the clearer it became that I had been blind to the signs. There had been moments, small, subtle moments that I had brushed off at the time. Things I should have noticed, but didn't. I had become complacent in my relationships, trusting that they were solid, that nothing could shatter the foundation we had built. It was a random day, nothing special about it, that I stumbled upon the truth. It wasn't something I was looking for, but sometimes, life has a way of forcing things into the light when you least expect it. I found a photo, an innocuous image at first, but the longer I looked at it, the more the reality of what I was seeing sank in. There they were, Ellen and Neil, together in a way that was more than just casual. It was intimate, personal. There was no mistaking it. My heart sank, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I'll be honest with you, I didn't know what to do in that moment. Part of me wanted to turn away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, to bury my head in the sand and live in the lie a little longer. But I couldn't. The truth had already planted itself in my mind, and I knew there was no going back. The betrayal had been right under my nose, and I had been too blinded by my own assumptions to see it. The next few days were a blur. I was living in a daze, walking through life in a fog, unable to process what had happened. I felt angry, hurt, and confused all at once. How could they do this to me? How could Ellen, the woman I loved, betray me like this? And Neil, my own brother, how could he have crossed that line? The emotions were overwhelming, and I didn't know how to handle them. I felt like everything I had believed in was crumbling around me. I didn't confront them immediately. I needed time to process everything. I needed to figure out what I was going to say, how I was going to approach the situation. I couldn't just walk in and confront them with accusations. I wasn't sure I could handle their reactions, or even my own. The idea of confronting them about something so personal, so damaging, seemed impossible. But it wasn't long before the weight of the truth became too much to bear. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. The more I questioned everything I thought I knew about my life. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I couldn't continue to live in this limbo, this uncomfortable space where the truth was right there, but I hadn't confronted it yet. And so, I decided that it was time. It was time to face the music. I had to ask them about it, had to demand the truth, no matter how painful it was. I was done being the victim of their lies. I needed closure. I needed to hear the words from their mouths, to know if my suspicions were true. When I confronted Ellen first, I wasn't prepared for the coldness in her eyes. The way she looked at me, as if she knew that I already knew, as if she was prepared for this moment all along, shocked me. There was no guilt, no regret in her expression, just a matter-of-fact look. Like she was simply waiting for me to catch up to the reality she had been living in. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I had to stay calm. I had to keep my composure, at least for a little while. "What's going on, Ellen?" I asked, my voice shaky but firm. "What's been happening between you and Neil?" For a moment, she just stared at me. Her silence was like a slap in the face. Finally, she let out a sigh. one that seemed like a mixture of relief and resignation. You know, don't you? The words hit me harder than I expected. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I saw the photo. I know everything. Her eyes flickered, but she didn't try to deny it. She didn't apologize. She didn't even seem to care. It's true, she said simply. I didn't want to hurt you, but it happened, and I didn't know how to fix it. The words stung, each one cutting deeper than the last. My mind raced as I tried to process what she was saying. This was the woman I had trusted with my heart, and now she was telling me that she had been living a double life, keeping this secret from me for who knows how long. Why, Ellen? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did you do this to me? To us? She didn't answer immediately, and I could see the guilt flicker in her eyes for a split second before she quickly masked it. I don't know, she finally said, her voice quiet. I don't know how it happened, but it did, and I can't take it back. That was the hardest part to hear. I couldn't take it back either. There was no going back to the life we had once shared, no way to rewind the clock and pretend everything was fine. I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I couldn't unknow what I knew. And then there was Neil. My own brother, the person I had trusted with everything. When I confronted him, his reaction was almost identical to Ellen's. He wasn't shocked, he wasn't remorseful, he just seemed resigned. It was as if he had been expecting this moment, and when it came, he was ready to face the consequences, whatever they were. I didn't want to hurt you either, he said, his voice lacking any real emotion. It just happened, and I can't change that now. The words were like a slap in the face. They meant nothing. They were excuses, nothing more. He didn't seem to care about what he had done to me, to our family. He didn't seem to care that he had broken something that could never be fixed. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair, it was about the trust that had been shattered, the foundation that had crumbled beneath me. I had given everything to both of them, and they had taken it all and thrown it away. And for what? A fleeting moment of selfishness? A desire for something they didn't even seem to value? I stood there, staring at them both, feeling completely hollow. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? There was nothing left to say. The damage had been done, but I wasn't going to let it end here. I wasn't going to let them destroy everything I had worked for, everything I had believed in. I knew what I had to do. I had to expose the truth. I couldn't let them get away with this. The silence in the room after my confrontation with Ellen and Neil was deafening. It felt as though the walls were closing in, suffocating me with their guilt. I was numb, not sure how to feel anymore. I had just been hit with a truth I wasn't ready to face, and now there was no turning back. The bond I had with them, my wife, my brother, my family, had been shattered in an instant, and nothing could fix it. I stood there, staring at them, unsure of how to move forward. I had so many questions, so many things I wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was look at them two people who had been a part of my life for so long, and now they were strangers. Strangers who had betrayed me in the worst way possible. But I wasn't going to let this destroy me. I couldn't. I had to take control of the situation, no matter how painful it was. I had to be strong for myself, for my future, and for the life I had lost. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, caught between anger, hurt, and disbelief. I needed a plan. I needed to make sure that whatever happened next, I would be in control. Why, Neil? I finally managed to ask, turning to face my brother. Why did you do this to me? To us? You've been a part of my life for so long, and you just betrayed me. Why? Neil didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be searching for the right words, but his face was unreadable. It was almost as if he was trying to convince himself that he hadn't done anything wrong. I don't know, man, he said, his voice weak. I didn't mean for it to happen, it just did. It's complicated. Complicated? I could feel my blood boiling. How could he stand there and say that? How could he dismiss the pain he had caused with such a weak excuse? It wasn't complicated. It was simple. He had made a choice. And it was a choice that had destroyed everything. I shook my head in disbelief. You think I'm just supposed to accept that? You think it's that simple? My voice was rising now, but I couldn't help it. You slept with my wife, Neil. You betrayed me in the worst way possible. And now you're just standing here, acting like it's no big deal. Neil's face flushed with frustration. I'm sorry, all right? What do you want me to say? I don't know why it happened. It was a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, incredulous. A mistake is spilling coffee on your shirt. A mistake is forgetting to pick up the dry cleaning. This isn't a mistake. This is a choice, a conscious decision. And you made it. There was a long pause before Neil spoke again, his voice almost pleading. I know. And I regret it, okay? But what do you want me to do? I can't undo it. I can't change the past. His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He couldn't change the past, and neither could I. But that didn't mean I had to accept what had happened. I didn't have to forgive him. Not yet. Not until I was ready. I turned away from him, my mind racing. I couldn't deal with Neil right now. The pain was too raw, too fresh. I needed to talk to Ellen. I needed answers from her, answers I wasn't sure I would ever get. When I turned to her, she didn't look at me. She was staring at the floor, her hands folded in her lap. She looked defeated, but not sorry. She looked like someone who had already made her peace with what had happened. And I hated that. Ellen, I said, my voice quieter now. How could you do this? How could you betray me like this? She didn't immediately respond, and for a moment, I thought she wasn't going to say anything at all. But then she spoke. Her voice soft but steady. I don't know what to say, Mark. I didn't plan for it to happen, but it did, and I can't change that. Her words hit me harder than I expected. The fact that she didn't even try to deny it, the fact that she was so calm about it, it made me sick to my stomach. Where was the remorse? Where was the guilt? I trusted you, I said, barely able to choke the words out. I gave you everything. And you. I'm sorry, she said, but the apology felt hollow. I never meant to hurt you. But I did. And I know I can't take it back. I could feel the anger building again, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to keep my composure. This wasn't about her, it was about me. It was about how I would handle the aftermath of this betrayal. It was about making sure I didn't lose myself in the process. Do you love him? I asked her, my voice cracking. Do you love Neil? Her eyes flickered at the question, but she didn't immediately answer. She looked away, as if she were searching for the right words. When she spoke again, it was almost a whisper. I don't know. I don't know what love is anymore. I've been lost for a long time. The words stung more than I anticipated. I didn't know what I expected her to say, but it certainly wasn't that. I had always believed in love, in the idea that love could overcome anything. But now I was starting to realize that love, as I had known it, was a fragile thing. And once broken, it was nearly impossible to fix. I turned away from her, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in my chest. I didn't want to hear her excuses anymore. I didn't want to listen to her explain why she had done what she did. There was no explanation that would make it better, no apology that would heal the wound she had caused. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with a deep sense of sadness. I wasn't just angry at Ellen and Neil, I was angry at myself. How could I have been so blind? How could I have missed the signs? Had I been so consumed with the idea of love that I couldn't see the truth when it was right in front of me? But as much as I hated them in that moment, I knew I had to take control. I had to decide what came next. I couldn't let them dictate my future. I couldn't let their betrayal define who I was. I had to find a way to move forward, even if I didn't know what that looked like yet. The only thing I knew for sure was that things would never be the same. The life I had once known, the life I thought I had, was gone. And now, I had to rebuild. The next few days were nothing short of a whirlwind. The anger, sadness, and confusion I felt after confronting Ellen and Neil didn't subside. In fact, it only seemed to grow stronger as I grappled with the reality of what had happened. I had always believed in the power of love, of commitment, of loyalty. But now, all of those ideals felt shattered. Everything I thought I knew about trust was turned upside down, and I was left questioning not only my relationship with Ellen and Neil, but also myself. How had I been so blind to the signs? How had I not seen this coming? I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the images of the betrayal, Ellen and Neil together, laughing, whispering, living in a world where I didn't exist. I could still feel the weight of her words, the way she had looked at me, almost as if she had already detached herself from our marriage. I couldn't make sense of any of it, and I hated myself for not knowing sooner. I hated myself for not protecting my heart. I spent the next few days in a haze. I tried to talk to friends, but it felt like they were as lost for words as I was. They didn't know how to comfort me. They didn't know what to say. Everyone wanted to tell me it wasn't my fault, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, that I had somehow let it all happen. It was hard to accept that I couldn't change the past. I couldn't go back and unsee what I had seen. The betrayal had already happened, and now I was left to deal with the aftermath. But in the midst of all the pain and heartache, there was one thing that stood out to me: the need to move forward. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to think about the future. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The betrayal had taken everything from me: my trust, my peace, my sense of security, but it hadn't taken away my strength. It hadn't taken away my ability to rebuild. I knew I couldn't stay in the same place, stuck in the past. I couldn't let Ellen and Neil define my future. Yes, they had hurt me deeply, but I couldn't let them take away my chance at happiness. I had to regain control over my own life. The decision to confront the reality of what had happened was not an easy one. For so long, I had allowed my life to be defined by the people around me. I had been a husband, a brother, a friend defined by the relationships I held dear. But now, I had to redefine myself. I had to find out who I was without them. One of the first things I did was seek help. I started therapy, something I had avoided for years. The thought of opening up to someone, of sharing my feelings so openly, was daunting, but I knew it was necessary. I had to process everything, to make sense of the chaos in my mind. And slowly, as the sessions went on, I began to unravel the layers of pain, fear, and confusion that had been building up for so long. Therapy helped me see something I hadn't fully understood before. I was allowed to feel my emotions, all of them. The anger, the sadness, the confusion, they were valid, but I also realized that I couldn't let them consume me. I had to process them, accept them, and then let them go. I couldn't hold on to the anger forever. I couldn't let it be the driving force in my life. I had to find a way to forgive both Ellen and Neil, but most importantly, myself. The journey wasn't going to be easy. Healing never is. But I was committed to it. I started taking small steps each day. I focused on my own well-being, eating right, exercising, getting enough sleep. I had neglected myself for so long that it felt strange to care for myself again, but it was necessary. I had to remind myself that I was worthy of love, of care, of respect. I wasn't the villain in this story. I hadn't done anything wrong. As I worked through my emotions and began to heal, I also made some hard decisions. I knew I couldn't stay in the same house. I couldn't live in a place where the memories of what had happened lingered around every corner. I needed space to breathe, to think, to heal. So, I made the decision to move out. The process of packing up my things was surreal. I had lived in that house for years, and it had once been a symbol of everything I had hoped for in my life. But now, it felt like a prison. It felt like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I needed to leave it behind, to start fresh. And as I packed up my belongings, I realized something important. I wasn't leaving behind the life I had built. I was leaving behind the lie. The facade that had been shattered. The life I had once known was gone. But that didn't mean I couldn't rebuild something better. The day I left was one of the hardest days of my life. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness as I drove away from the house. I was leaving behind memories of the past, both good and bad. But I was also stepping into a new chapter, one where I had the power to define my own future. The next few weeks were difficult, but they were also enlightening. I began to realize how much of my identity had been tied to my relationships with Ellen and Neil. I had defined myself as a husband, a brother, a man who had a stable family. But now, I had to define myself as an individual. I had to rediscover who I was outside of those roles. It was a process of rebuilding, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, but I was determined to get through it. And in the midst of all this, I started to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I was learning to stand on my own again. I was learning to trust myself, to believe in my own strength. I wasn't the same person I had been before. I was someone stronger, more resilient, someone who had been knocked down but refused to stay down. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but I was ready for it. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready to embrace whatever came next. The weeks that followed my decision to leave were filled with moments of reflection. There were times when I felt incredibly lost, uncertain about the future and where my life was headed. But there were also moments when I felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity, as though I was seeing the world through new eyes. I realized that I was no longer tied to the life I had built with Ellen and Neil. I had the freedom to create a new path, one that was entirely mine. It wasn't easy, but it was a chance to rebuild myself, to rediscover who I was without the weight of betrayal hanging over me. As I settled into my new place, I found myself surrounded by a strange mix of comfort and discomfort. The apartment was small, but it felt like a blank slate, a place where I could start over, where I could let go of the past and begin the healing process. It wasn't a perfect home, but it was mine. It didn't come with memories of a shared life, and that was exactly what I needed. There were no reminders of the hurt, no traces of the lies that had shattered everything. But even in this new space, there were days when the pain still crept in. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, unable to silence the thoughts running through my mind. I would replay the moments of betrayal, wondering where I had gone wrong, questioning everything I thought I knew about Ellen and Neil. How could they do this to me? How could they be so selfish, so deceitful? I had trusted them both with everything, and they had broken that trust in the most painful way possible. But as time went on, I began to realize that the pain, while it would never completely disappear, wasn't something I could let control my life. I couldn't spend every waking moment consumed by it. I had to take the power back. I had to take control of my own future, and that meant allowing myself to feel the pain, but not letting it define me. One of the first things I did to start this process of healing was to take up activities I had long neglected. I had always loved painting, but it had been years since I'd picked up a brush. I had allowed myself to get so caught up in my relationships that I had forgotten about the things that brought me joy. So, one evening, I dusted off my old set of paints and began to create again. The act of putting paint on a canvas was therapeutic. It was a way for me to express the emotions I had been bottling up, to release the tension that had built up in my body. I didn't have to explain my feelings to anyone, I could just paint them, and in doing so, I found a sense of peace. It wasn't just about painting, though. I began to focus more on my physical health as well. I had always been someone who took care of myself, who made time for exercise and self-care. But after everything that had happened, I had neglected myself. I hadn't been eating well, I wasn't working out, and I had allowed stress to take a toll on my body. So, I made the conscious decision to take better care of myself. I started going to the gym regularly again, eating healthier meals, and making sure I got enough rest. The physical activity not only helped me feel stronger, but it also gave me a sense of control. It was one area of my life that I could take charge of, and it helped me feel more grounded. I also started setting new goals for myself, both professionally and personally. For years, I had put my career on the back burner. I had been so consumed with my marriage, with trying to make everything work, that I had lost sight of my own ambitions. But now, I was ready to pick up where I had left off. I began to network with old colleagues, seek new opportunities, and push myself outside of my comfort zone. I had always been passionate about my work, but I had allowed myself to get distracted. Now, I was rediscovering that passion, and it felt invigorating. It felt like I was finally waking up to the person I had always been underneath the layers of doubt and pain. As I focused more on myself and my growth, I realized something important. I didn't need anyone to complete me. For so long, I had relied on my relationship with Ellen and my bond with Neil to define who I was. But now, I was learning to define myself. I didn't need their approval or validation. I was whole on my own, and that was something I had to come to terms with. The journey wasn't about finding someone else to fix me. It was about learning to fix myself, to heal myself. But the hardest part of this entire process was learning to trust again. Trust had been the foundation of every relationship in my life, and now it felt like something I could never have again. I was scared of letting anyone else in, scared of getting hurt again. But I knew that if I wanted to move forward, I had to find a way to trust not necessarily others, but myself. I had to trust that I was capable of making the right choices, of protecting myself from being hurt again. I had to trust that I could handle whatever came my way. I also had to come to terms with forgiveness. I wasn't there yet, but I knew that one day I would have to forgive Ellen and Neil. Not for them, but for me. Holding on to the anger and resentment only kept me tethered to the past. And as much as I wanted to lash out, as much as I wanted to make them feel the pain they had caused me, I knew that holding on to that bitterness would only destroy me. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing what they had done, it was about letting go of the power they still held over me. It was about taking back control over my own life, my own happiness. The more time passed, the more I began to find peace in the stillness. There were days when I felt like I was making progress, and then there were days when I felt like I was right back at square one. But that's the nature of healing. It's not linear. It's messy, complicated, and unpredictable, and that's okay. What mattered was that I kept moving forward, even on the days when it felt impossible. As I continued to rebuild my life, I started to find joy in the small things again. I found comfort in the simple act of waking up to a new day, of going for a walk in the park, of laughing with friends. I began to enjoy the freedom that came with being alone, with having the space to think and breathe and simply exist without the weight of betrayal hanging over me. And though I was still healing, I knew that I was on the right path. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know exactly where life would take me, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength to face it. As the days went by, I began to understand that healing wasn't something that happened in one grand gesture. It wasn't a moment of realization, a singular event that would suddenly make everything better. It was small, incremental steps that built on each other. It was about waking up every day and choosing to move forward, even when the weight of the past was still heavy on my shoulders. I had a lot of time to think, to process everything that had happened. There were days when I felt like I was making great strides, when I could see the person I was becoming, the strength I was building. And then there were days when it felt like I was back at square one. The anger and pain would surge back, sometimes catching me off guard, and I'd find myself wondering if I would ever truly be free of it. But that's the nature of recovery, isn't it? It's not a straight line. Some days, the past feels like it's buried, and other days, it feels like it's right there, just beneath the surface. But what mattered was that I was learning to live with it. I wasn't running away from my emotions anymore. I was acknowledging them, accepting them, and allowing myself to feel whatever came up. I wasn't ashamed of my pain, and I wasn't ashamed of my healing process. During this time, I also began to think more about my future. For so long, I had been focused on my present pain, on the betrayal, on the hurt, on the devastation. But now, I was starting to look ahead, to think about the possibilities that lay before me. I knew I couldn't stay in this place of hurt forever. I knew that I needed to rebuild my life in a way that allowed me to grow, to find happiness again. But that didn't mean forgetting about what had happened. The past was still a part of me, and it always would be. But I was learning how to make peace with it, how to take the lessons from it and use them to shape a better future. I didn't have to erase the pain, but I could choose not to let it define me. One of the things I realized as I moved through this process was how much of my life had been shaped by the expectations of others. I had spent years trying to meet the needs of those around me, of Ellen, of Neil, of society's idea of what a happy, successful life should look like. And in doing so, I had lost sight of myself. I had ignored my own needs, my own desires, in favor of pleasing others. But now, I was learning to listen to myself. I was learning to trust my own instincts, to prioritize my own happiness. This wasn't an easy shift. It was uncomfortable at first, this idea of putting myself first. I had spent so much of my life taking care of others, trying to be everything to everyone, that the thought of focusing on myself felt selfish. But over time, I realized that taking care of myself wasn't selfish at all. It was necessary. If I couldn't take care of myself, I couldn't take care of anyone else. And if I didn't start living for myself, I would never find true happiness. I began to focus more on what truly mattered to me. I spent time doing things I loved, things I had neglected for so long. I revisited hobbies that I had put aside, like reading, painting, and hiking. I spent time with friends who lifted me up, who supported me without question. And, most importantly, I spent time alone, learning to enjoy my own company. I realized that I had never really been comfortable with being alone. I had always needed someone else to fill the space, to validate my existence. But now, I was learning that I didn't need anyone else to complete me. I was complete on my own. The more I practiced self-care, the more I began to feel a shift in my mindset. I started to trust myself more. I started to believe that I was worthy of the love and respect I had always given to others. I began to see that the love I had for myself wasn't just a fleeting feeling, it was a foundation for everything else. It was the foundation I needed to build a life that was mine, a life that was not defined by the pain of the past. But this journey wasn't just about self-care, it was about learning to trust others again. The betrayal by Ellen and Neil had made me question everything I thought I knew about relationships. How could I ever trust anyone again? How could I open myself up to love after everything I had been through? It wasn't an easy question to answer. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, and I knew that I couldn't rush the process. I had to be patient with myself. I had to learn how to trust again, but it had to be on my own terms. It couldn't be forced. It had to come naturally, slowly, over time. I didn't rush into dating again. I knew I wasn't ready for that yet. But I started to open myself up to new connections. I made new friends, deepened existing relationships, and allowed myself to be vulnerable again. And in doing so, I began to see that trust, while fragile, was still possible, but it had to be earned. I couldn't just give it away to anyone. I had to choose who I allowed into my life carefully, and I had to be discerning about the people I let get close to me. This process of rebuilding trust wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I had to trust myself first, and once I had done that, I could begin to trust others again, little by little. I wasn't expecting perfection. I wasn't expecting anyone to be flawless, but I was willing to give people a chance to prove themselves, to show me that they were worthy of my trust. And in doing so, I realized that not everyone was going to hurt me. Not everyone was going to betray me. There were still people out there who were genuine, who were kind, who were trustworthy. As I moved forward, I started to see that life wasn't just about avoiding pain, it was about embracing it. It was about allowing yourself to feel the hurt, to acknowledge it, and then to let it go. It was about learning from it and using it to grow stronger. It was about choosing to keep moving forward, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. There were still days when I felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened. There were still moments when the pain would resurface, when I would question everything. But I had learned to handle those moments. I had learned that it was okay to feel the pain, but it didn't have to control me. I was in control of my own happiness, my own future. And slowly, I began to realize something else. I was stronger than I had ever known. The betrayal had hurt me deeply, yes, but it had also taught me more about myself than I had ever imagined. I had learned to trust myself, to love myself, and to stand up for myself. I had learned that I didn't need anyone else to complete me. I was enough, just as I was. The future was still uncertain, but I was ready to face it. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer afraid of the pain, the uncertainty, or the unknown. I was ready to embrace whatever came next. The weeks following my decision to move on and begin rebuilding my life were a mix of emotions. There were moments of progress, small victories where I could feel myself growing stronger, more resilient. But there were also setbacks, times when the weight of the past seemed to crush me all over again, reminding me that healing wasn't a straight line. Some days, I felt like I was taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Other days, it felt like I was taking 10 steps back. I realized early on that this journey wouldn't be easy. There were days when I wanted to give up, when I wanted to crawl into bed and shut out the world. But I had made a promise to myself that I wouldn't let the pain define me. I refused to let it consume me. Yes, I was hurting, and yes, I had been betrayed in the worst way possible, but I was still alive. I still had the chance to change my future. And that, in itself, was worth fighting for. One of the most difficult parts of healing was dealing with the anger that seemed to come from nowhere. Anger at Ellen for betraying me, for destroying everything we had worked for. Anger at Neil for breaking the bond of trust between brothers. But most of all, anger at myself. How could I have missed the signs? How could I have been so naive, so trusting, that I didn't see what was happening right under my nose? The anger was overwhelming at times. It burned deep inside me, and it wasn't always easy to control. I had moments where I wanted to scream, where I wanted to lash out and make them feel the hurt I was carrying. But then, I realized something important. Anger, if I let it, would only make me miserable. It would only keep me tied to the past, to the pain. And that was the last thing I needed. I began to understand that anger was a natural response to betrayal, but I couldn't let it control me. I had to let it go. I had to channel that energy into something productive, something that would help me heal instead of keeping me stuck. That's when I decided to focus on my purpose, on what I wanted from life moving forward. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to dream again. I had been so focused on maintaining the life I thought I should have, so consumed by my relationship with Ellen and my brother, that I had neglected my own desires, my own goals. But now, I had the opportunity to rewrite my story. I had the freedom to pursue the things I had always wanted to do but had put on hold for the sake of others. I started by revisiting old passions, things I had once loved but had abandoned. I had always been passionate about writing, but it was something I hadn't done in years. I used to write short stories, poems, anything that allowed me to express my feelings. It was my escape, my way of making sense of the world. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped. I had let life get in the way of my creativity, of my self-expression. So I picked up my pen again. At first, the words didn't come easily. It felt awkward, like I was trying to reconnect with a part of myself that had been buried for too long. But as I continued, I found myself lost in the stories I was creating. Writing became my therapy. It allowed me to process my emotions, to give voice to the things I had been unable to say out loud. I poured all of my anger, my sadness, my confusion into the pages, and in doing so, I found a sense of release. I began to feel lighter, as though I was freeing myself from the weight of the past. But writing wasn't the only thing I wanted to pursue. I had always dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world, experiencing new cultures, meeting new people. Ellen and I had talked about traveling together, but our plans had always fallen through. Now, I wasn't waiting for anyone else. I wasn't waiting for the perfect time. I was going to make it happen for myself. I started making plans. I researched destinations, booked flights, and created an itinerary. The idea of traveling alone was both exciting and intimidating. I had never been on a trip by myself before, but I knew this was something I needed to do. It wasn't just about escaping my problems, it was about finding myself. It was about embracing the unknown and stepping out of my comfort zone. I was determined to break free from the life that had been holding me back. As I prepared for my trip, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in years. I was going to explore new places, discover new things, and, most importantly, I was going to do it for me. I wasn't doing this for anyone else's approval or validation. I was doing it because I deserved it. I deserved to experience the world on my own terms. The trip wasn't just about sightseeing or adventure, it was about rediscovering my independence. It was about learning to be comfortable in my own skin, to trust myself, and to embrace the freedom that came with living life on my own terms. I knew there would be challenges along the way. I knew I would have moments of doubt, of loneliness. But I also knew that this was part of the process. This was how I was going to heal. This was how I was going to reclaim my life. When the day finally came to leave, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I was stepping into the unknown, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. Ready to face whatever came my way. Ready to embrace the future. The trip itself was everything I hoped it would be. I wandered through bustling markets in foreign cities, took in breathtaking views from mountain tops, and savored exotic foods that opened my eyes to new cultures. But more than that, I rediscovered a part of myself I had lost. I found a sense of peace and independence I hadn't realized I needed. I learned to be content with my own company, to enjoy the silence and stillness that came with being alone. And when I returned home, I was a different person. I had changed not in the way I had expected, but in a way that made me stronger, more self-assured. I was no longer the person who had been consumed by betrayal, by anger, by hurt. I was someone who had learned to let go of the past and embrace the future. I had learned that happiness didn't come from the people around me or the circumstances in my life, it came from within. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know exactly what the future held. But I knew one thing for sure. I was ready to face it. I was ready to build a new life, one that was mine, one that reflected who I was and who I wanted to be. And as I stood there, looking out at the horizon, I realized something profound. The journey was far from over. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt, but I was no longer afraid. I was no longer afraid to live, to love, and to embrace the uncertainty of the future. Because now I knew I could handle whatever came my way. It had been a few months since my return from the trip. The time I spent traveling had changed me in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. When I first embarked on that journey, I had been unsure of what I was looking for. Was I running away from the pain of betrayal? Was I hoping to find something out there that would heal the wounds Ellen and Neil had caused? The truth was, I didn't know what I was looking for. But I knew I had to leave. I knew I needed to take that first step toward rebuilding my life and, more importantly, myself. Now, back home, I realized that what I had discovered on my travels wasn't a simple answer, nor was it an immediate cure. What I found was peace in my own company, in my own thoughts, and in the quiet moments where I didn't have to justify my existence to anyone. The trip had been about regaining my independence, about proving to myself that I could stand on my own, without the crutch of a relationship or the expectations of others. But that was just the beginning. The real work began when I returned, when I had to put into practice everything I had learned during my time away. The first few weeks back were the hardest. I thought I had healed while I was away, but coming back to my apartment, to the life I was rebuilding, felt like stepping into an entirely new world. The quiet of the space was overwhelming, almost suffocating. It was my own sanctuary, yes, but it felt empty, like I was still searching for something. I wasn't sure what that something was. It wasn't a person, it wasn't a new relationship, and it wasn't a distraction. It was simply me reconnecting with myself in a deeper, more authentic way. I knew I had to face the reality that rebuilding myself wasn't going to happen overnight. It wasn't going to be some magical transformation where I woke up one day and everything felt perfect again. It was going to take time, patience, self-reflection, and the courage to keep moving forward, even on the days when the past tried to drag me back. The first step in that process was rediscovering the parts of myself I had neglected for so long. I had always been a creative person, but for years I had put those passions on hold, telling myself I didn't have time for them. My relationship with Ellen and Neil had taken up so much of my energy, and I had let my own dreams fall to the side. But now I had the opportunity to pick up those pieces again. I started painting again. It felt like coming home. There was something deeply therapeutic about picking up a paintbrush and creating something from nothing. The strokes of color on the canvas were like a form of self-expression I hadn't allowed myself in years. As I painted, I allowed my emotions to flow onto the canvas, not holding back, not worrying about perfection. I realized that this was the freedom I had been searching for, freedom to express myself, to create without judgment, and to connect with my emotions in a way that was raw and honest. But painting wasn't the only thing I reconnected with. I also started writing again. Writing had always been my outlet, the way I made sense of the world around me. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped. I had let life take over, and my passion for storytelling had faded. But when I returned home, I knew that it was time to rediscover that part of myself. At first, it felt difficult. My mind was clouded with the pain of the past, and I wasn't sure how to put that into words. But as the days passed, the words began to flow again. Slowly at first, but with more certainty, as I allowed myself to be vulnerable on the page. I wrote about my journey, about the pain of betrayal, about the uncertainty I felt about the future. But I also wrote about the moments of peace, the moments when I found strength in the silence, and the moments when I realized that I was no longer defined by what had happened to me. Writing became another form of therapy, a way to process the emotions I hadn't been able to verbalize. It was liberating in a way I hadn't expected, and with each word, I began to feel lighter, as if the weight of my past was slowly being lifted. I also found myself reconnecting with people. It wasn't easy at first. I had distanced myself from so many of my friends when I was in my relationship, allowing my focus to shift entirely to Ellen and Neil. But now, I was determined to rebuild the relationships I had let slip away. I reached out to old friends, made time for social events, and allowed myself to be present with others again. But I wasn't just looking for distractions. I was looking for genuine connection, for people who understood me, who supported my growth, and who didn't judge me for my past mistakes. I wasn't trying to fill a void anymore. I was trying to create meaningful relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. As I reconnected with old friends, I also found myself meeting new people, people who were going through their own struggles, their own journeys of self-discovery. And in those connections, I found solace. I found that I wasn't alone in my pain, that others had their own stories of heartache and growth. It made me realize that we're all on this journey together, and we can learn from one another. We can support each other through the ups and downs. It wasn't just about people, though. It was also about learning to be content in my own company. For so long, I had been afraid of being alone, afraid of facing the silence. But now, I was beginning to understand that the silence wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. The time I spent alone became a time for reflection, for personal growth, for deepening my understanding of who I was and what I wanted from life. I spent weekends alone, exploring the city, going for walks in the park, sitting in cafes, reading books, and simply observing the world around me. It wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. It was my time to recharge, to reconnect with myself, and to find joy in the small moments. I realized that I didn't need to be constantly surrounded by noise or people to feel fulfilled. I was enough, just as I was. But as I settled into this new rhythm of life, I also began to think about the future. I had spent so much time thinking about the past, the betrayal, the hurt, the anger, that I hadn't allowed myself to dream about what could come next. I was ready to start thinking about my future, to consider new possibilities, to think about what kind of life I wanted to create for myself moving forward. One of the biggest realizations I had during this time was that I wasn't going to let the betrayal define me. It had been a part of my journey, yes, but it wasn't the whole story. There was so much more to my life than that one chapter. I had the power to decide how the next chapter would unfold. I wasn't going to let anyone else control that narrative. It was mine to write, and I was determined to make it a good one. So I began to set new goals for myself, goals that were focused on personal growth, on building a future that was mine, and on creating the life I wanted to live. I started planning for things I had always dreamed of: traveling to new places, learning new skills, and building a career that was truly fulfilling. I wasn't going to let the past hold me back anymore. I was moving forward with purpose and determination. And in those quiet moments of reflection, I realized that the pain of the betrayal, while still there, wasn't as sharp as it had once been. It had become something I could live with, something I could learn from. The experience had taught me so much about myself, about my strength, my resilience, and my ability to rebuild. I wasn't the person I had been before all of this. I was stronger, wiser, and more aware of my own worth. I still had a long way to go. The journey wasn't over, and I knew there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. I felt ready to embrace whatever came my way, knowing that I had the strength to handle it. And as I looked forward, I knew that no matter what happened, I was finally in control of my own life. I had learned to trust myself, to believe in my own ability to overcome obstacles. And that was a power no one could ever take away from me. The idea of moving forward was no longer a distant thought for me. It was becoming my reality. It had been months since my world had been turned upside down, months since the betrayal had shattered my life. But slowly and surely, I was rebuilding it. The pain was still there, lingering in the background, but I wasn't letting it dictate my future anymore. I was taking control of my life, one step at a time. I had learned that the process of healing wasn't linear, and there was no set timeline for how long it would take to feel whole again. Some days I felt stronger, like I could face anything, and then there were days when the sadness crept back in, when the memories of what had happened felt overwhelming. But I was learning to accept those moments for what they were, temporary setbacks on a journey that was, ultimately, mine to navigate. I had started embracing the things that once brought me joy, things I had ignored for so long. I spent weekends cooking meals for myself, exploring new recipes, and learning how to appreciate the art of nurturing my own body. I rediscovered the power of quiet mornings, the sound of birds chirping outside my window as I sipped my coffee, reading a book, or simply enjoying the stillness of the moment. There was something profoundly comforting about being alone in my own space, something I had never fully appreciated before. I realized that being alone didn't equate to loneliness. I was learning to be at peace with myself, to find comfort in solitude, to not feel the need to fill every moment with noise or distractions. But as much as I cherished this new sense of independence, I also began to think about relationships in a different way. I had spent so long focusing on the betrayal, on what had been taken from me, that I hadn't allowed myself to fully consider the possibilities of new connections. I wasn't ready to jump back into a romantic relationship yet, but I started to open myself up to new friendships, to meet people who shared my interests, people who respected my journey and my healing process. I met a few people who were also on their own paths of self-discovery, people who understood the importance of personal growth and healing. Our conversations weren't rushed or forced. We didn't feel the need to fill the air with endless chatter. Instead, we shared stories, supported one another, and offered encouragement. It was a refreshing change from the relationships I had experienced before, where everything had been about expectations, about what I was supposed to be or do. With these new friends, I could simply be myself, and that was a gift. But as I grew in this new phase of my life, I began to recognize something crucial. I couldn't truly move forward without letting go of the past. I had been holding on to the anger, the resentment, the questions that had plagued me since the betrayal. I had been clinging to the belief that if I just understood why they had done it, if I just had all the answers, maybe I could heal. But I realized that the need for answers was holding me back. It wasn't about them anymore, it was about me. Forgiveness wasn't something that happened overnight, I knew that. But I had to start somewhere. And the first step was letting go of the idea that I needed to have all the answers, that I needed to know every detail about why Ellen and Neil had done what they did. That wasn't going to change the fact that it had happened. What mattered now was how I moved forward. What mattered was how I chose to heal, and how I chose to rebuild my life. It wasn't about absolving them of their actions. It wasn't about excusing their betrayal. But it was about freeing myself from the weight of the past, from the bitterness and the anger that had consumed me for so long. I realized that forgiveness wasn't a gift for them, it was a gift for me. It was the only way I could truly move on. So, I made the decision to forgive. Not for their sake, but for mine. It didn't mean that everything was okay. It didn't mean that I could go back to the way things were. It meant that I was no longer going to let their actions control my life. I was going to take my power back. And that began with forgiveness. The process wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I hadn't forgiven them at all. There were moments when the anger flared up, when I remembered how deeply they had hurt me, and I felt all the old emotions rise to the surface. But I kept reminding myself that forgiveness wasn't a one-time event, it was a choice. A choice I had to make every day. As the days passed, I felt lighter. It wasn't instantaneous, but the burden of the past began to feel less heavy. The moments of peace I had found within myself started to outweigh the moments of anger. The memories of betrayal weren't as sharp as they once were. They didn't sting the way they had in the beginning. And I realized that this was the process of healing. It was about making peace with what had happened, accepting it, and choosing to move forward regardless. I started to focus on the things that brought me joy, things that I had neglected for so long. I began traveling again, not just on the big trip I had taken earlier, but smaller trips, weekend getaways, visits to places I had always wanted to see. I wanted to experience the world outside of the pain, outside of the betrayal. I wanted to prove to myself that life still had beauty, still had wonder, and that there was so much more to discover. I also started taking on new challenges. I had always wanted to learn a new language, so I enrolled in classes. I had always wanted to explore creative writing, so I began working on a novel. I started to rebuild my career, finding new opportunities that aligned with my passions. Opportunities that didn't require me to sacrifice my happiness for the sake of others. I was making decisions based on what I truly wanted, not based on what was expected of me. And as I worked on rebuilding my life, I began to see the transformation in myself. I had become someone stronger, more confident, more aware of who I was and what I wanted. I was no longer the person who had been defined by betrayal. I was no longer the person who had been trapped by the past. I was someone who was free, someone who had the power to create their own future. But there was still one thing left: love. The idea of love had become complicated for me. I had once thought that love was the answer to everything, that love would make everything better. But now, I knew that love couldn't be the answer to everything. It couldn't fix the broken pieces of my heart. But love, I realized, was still important. It was still something worth pursuing, something worth building if it was the right kind of love. I wasn't ready to jump into a new relationship yet, but I was open to the possibility of love again. I knew now that love wasn't about finding someone to fix me. It was about two people coming together as whole individuals, respecting each other's journeys and building something beautiful together. And so, I started to believe in love again, not as something that could save me, but as something that could complement the life I had already built for myself. I was no longer searching for validation. I was no longer searching for completion. I was searching for connection. Real, honest, vulnerable connection. And with that realization, I understood something important. I didn't need someone to complete me. I was already complete. The love I had for myself was enough. And with that love, I was ready to embrace whatever the future held, whether it was love, new opportunities, or simply the next chapter of my journey. The more I moved forward, the more I came to realize that life was never as simple as I had once believed. There were no clear paths, no guarantees, no roadmap for what came next. The life I had once known was gone, and in its place was a vast, unknown future. One that was full of potential, but also full of uncertainty. And it was that uncertainty that both terrified and thrilled me. It was the unknown that made me nervous, that made me second-guess every decision I made. What if I chose the wrong path? What if I made the wrong move? What if, in my quest for happiness, I ended up making the same mistakes all over again? But in the midst of those fears, I began to see something else. Something that had eluded me for so long. I began to understand that uncertainty wasn't something to fear. It wasn't something to run from. It was something to embrace. The idea of embracing uncertainty wasn't easy for me. For most of my life, I had tried to control everything, my relationships, my career, my future. I had believed that if I worked hard enough, if I did everything right, I could create a perfect life. But the truth was, no matter how hard I tried, things didn't always go according to plan. Life had a way of throwing curveballs, of challenging my expectations and forcing me to adapt. The betrayal by Ellen and Neil had taught me that the idea of control was an illusion. I couldn't control the actions of others. I couldn't dictate how my relationships would unfold, and I couldn't control the future. But I could control how I responded to what life threw my way. I could control my attitude, my mindset, and my willingness to face the unknown with courage. As I started embracing the uncertainty of the future, I realized that it was actually freeing. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to force things into existence. I wasn't trying to create a life that fit some idealized version of what I thought it should be. I was simply living, moment by moment, and trusting that whatever happened, I would be okay. That didn't mean I was complacent, or that I wasn't working toward building a fulfilling life. Quite the opposite, actually. Embracing uncertainty meant that I was allowing myself to pursue what felt right for me, without worrying so much about the end result. I was giving myself permission to take risks, to make mistakes, and to learn from them. I was giving myself the freedom to grow and evolve without the pressure of having it all figured out. I started doing things that scared me, things I had avoided in the past. I enrolled in an improv class, something I had always wanted to try but had been too afraid of failing. The first few classes were awkward, but over time I found myself laughing, loosening up, and connecting with others in ways I hadn't expected. It was a small thing, but it felt like a huge victory. It reminded me that life was about the journey, not just the destination. And it was okay if the journey didn't always go as planned. I also began to explore new career opportunities. But this time, I wasn't chasing success for the sake of success. I was looking for meaning. I was looking for work that would inspire me, work that would align with my values, work that would allow me to grow and contribute in a way that felt authentic. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I was taking steps in the right direction, trusting that the pieces would eventually fall into place. The more I leaned into the unknown, the more I realized how much freedom it brought me. I wasn't bound by the past anymore. I wasn't bound by the expectations of others. I wasn't even bound by the need for approval or validation. I was free to be who I truly was, to follow my own path and trust that I had the strength to handle whatever challenges came my way. There were still days when the doubt crept in, when the fear of failure reared its ugly head. But now, I knew how to handle it. I knew that failure wasn't the end. It was just a part of the process. It was a lesson, an opportunity for growth, and I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I had learned that life wasn't about avoiding pain or discomfort. It was about learning how to move through it, how to embrace it as part of the human experience. The pain of betrayal, the loss of trust, the uncertainty of the future, they were all pieces of the puzzle that made me who I was. They didn't define me, but they shaped me, and they would continue to shape me in ways I couldn't yet understand. The more I embraced the unknown, the more I found peace in it. I realized that life didn't have to be perfect. It didn't have to follow a set of rules or expectations. It could be messy, unpredictable, and chaotic, but it could also be beautiful. And that beauty, I realized, came from the willingness to take risks, to step into the unknown with open arms, and to trust that whatever came next, I would be okay. I started to let go of the need to control everything. I stopped obsessing over the future, over what might happen, and started focusing on the present. The present was all I had, and it was enough. I didn't need to know what was going to happen tomorrow, or next year, or in 5 years. All I needed to do was live today and trust that the future would unfold as it was meant to. And so, I did. I allowed myself to take one step at a time, without worrying so much about where each step would lead. I allowed myself to trust the process, to trust that I was on the right path, even if I didn't know exactly where it would take me. In those quiet moments of reflection, I realized that I had already come so far. I had been through the worst kind of betrayal, and I had come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and more resilient. I had learned how to trust myself, how to love myself, and how to move forward with courage. I had learned that the future was full of possibility, and that uncertainty was not something to fear, it was something to embrace. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I was ready for it. And whatever came my way, I would face it with an open heart and an open mind. I had learned to trust myself, and I knew that was all I needed to navigate whatever came next. As I reached this point in my journey, the weight of the past seemed lighter, not because I had forgotten what happened. No, the betrayal still lingered in the corners of my mind like a scar that would never completely fade. But I had learned how to live with it. I had learned that my life was still my own, despite the events that had tried to define me, despite the pain that had tried to hold me back. The past, for all its lessons, was no longer a shackle around my ankles. It was a part of me, yes, but it was no longer the whole of me, and I could choose to move forward on my terms. It was an empowering realization, one that came with the realization that I no longer needed to live in the shadow of the people who had hurt me. I didn't need their approval or validation to live the life I wanted. I had found something far more important: the strength to stand on my own, the strength to trust in myself again. The days when I was consumed by anger and sadness felt far behind me, though the echoes of that pain would always be there, reminding me of what I had survived. And yet, as I grew stronger, those memories began to lose their power over me. They no longer controlled my emotions. They no longer controlled my choices. For the first time in a long time, I felt the space inside myself open up. I had spent so long closing myself off from the world, trying to protect my heart, trying to prevent anyone from hurting me again. But in doing so, I had also closed myself off from the things that made life worth living: connection, joy, love. I realized now that I didn't need to fear love. I didn't need to fear trust. I had been hurt, yes, but that didn't mean I was destined to live in fear of it happening again. What had happened with Ellen and Neil was painful and unfair, but it wasn't the end of the road. It was a bump in the path, a lesson, not a final destination. And I had learned enough to know that I wasn't going to let that define my future. The truth was, the hardest part of the healing process wasn't just forgiving others, it was forgiving myself. I had spent so much time blaming myself for not seeing the signs, for not noticing what was happening right in front of me. I had beaten myself up for being too trusting, too naive, too hopeful. I had spent hours wondering what I could have done differently, what I had missed, and what I could have done to prevent the heartbreak. But in the end, I had to accept that I couldn't change the past. I couldn't go back and unsee what I had seen. I couldn't undo the mistakes I had made. But what I could do was move forward. What I could do was let go of the guilt and the regret that had been holding me back. What I could do was forgive myself and trust that, in time, the scars would heal. It wasn't easy. Some days, I felt overwhelmed by the weight of everything I had gone through. The pain still had a way of creeping up when I least expected it, and sometimes, I felt like I would never fully be free of it. But other days, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of lightness, like I was finally learning how to breathe again. The best part of this journey, though, was the rediscovery of my own worth. I had spent so many years measuring my value by the relationships I had, by what Ellen and Neil thought of me, by what others expected of me. But now, I realized that my worth wasn't dependent on anyone else. I didn't need someone else's approval to be happy. I didn't need anyone else's love to feel complete. I was already whole. And as I realized this, I also began to see that the future, while uncertain, was full of possibilities. It wasn't about looking back at what had gone wrong or what I had lost. It was about looking forward at what could be, at what I was capable of achieving, at the life I was capable of building. I was no longer defined by the past. I was free to create my own future. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to dream again. I began thinking about what I wanted to achieve, where I wanted to go, who I wanted to become. I no longer felt the need to play it safe, to follow the path I thought was expected of me. Now, I was creating my own path, one step at a time. It was a little scary, but it was also exhilarating. There was no rush. I didn't need to have it all figured out. Life wasn't about getting to some destination, it was about the journey. And for the first time, I was truly living it, with all its ups and downs, its uncertainties and possibilities. I realized now that the most important relationship I would ever have was the one I had with myself. If I couldn't love myself, if I couldn't trust myself, then I couldn't expect anyone else to. I had to believe in my own worth before I could open myself up to others. I had to be content in my own skin before I could ask someone else to accept me. I wasn't there yet, I wasn't perfect, but I was trying. Every day, I was doing my best to show up for myself, to prioritize my needs, and to be the person I wanted to be. I was learning how to live for myself, not for anyone else. As I stood on the edge of this new chapter in my life, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for everything that had happened. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been fair, but it had taught me so much. It had forced me to confront my deepest fears, to face the things I had been avoiding, and to learn how to love myself. I still had a long way to go. The future was still uncertain, still full of questions, but for the first time in a long time, I was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. I wasn't looking for someone to fix me. I wasn't looking for someone else to define my worth. I was ready to write my own story, to take control of my own life. And no matter what happened, no matter where life took me, I knew one thing for sure. I was enough.